Welcome back to the study on George Washington's Spurs. This time I'll be discussing a lifelong companion of George Washington's, William Lee. Phyllis Wheatley, who was a famous poet of her day, wrote this of George Washington: "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington be thine." Phyllis Wheatley's words of Washington will be remembered for all generations, as they were a call to action, not just for Washington, but for the freedom of the new states and the future they would bring. Welcome back to 17th and 18th century horsemanship. I'm going to conclude this study by highlighting some other names of horsemen who are connected to Washington's Spurs. This way we will always know and remember the talents of these horsemen and explore the dreams of the future Washington hoped to give the new republic. I'll start this story off by saying that Washington was not alone in his horsemanship expertise on his estate. Stating a list of horses that he listed at Mount Vernon in 1785 and 86, there were some 126 horses across his estate. Many of them had names. It was beyond likely that the people who worked there were the ones who named and trained the horses. Some amazing names that stick out are Dr., Pompey, Diamond, Dragon. Dragon was a wagon horse. Again, these were likely picked by the men and women on the estate, many of whom were people who were enslaved. Not all of them, but most. And every single person there definitely had their own name, and Washington recorded each one. And each person had talent. Regarding the people who were enslaved, thankfully not all slavery was the same. And Mount Vernon was no sugar plantation. These people there had massive personalities. By 1786, Washington stated, "I never mean, unless some particular circumstances should compel me to it, to possess another slave by purchase, it being among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by the legislature by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees." He wanted it to be imperceptible so as to avoid a civil war. Now, on the estate, there were two men, at least, who were hailed as talented horsemen. These are men who also rode Washington's own horses. Their names come up again and again in my research. They were Giles and Paris. They were coachmen. Now, let's briefly get into the culture of what coachmen could do. They could drive the horses, sometimes several at once. They could tack the horses up for a harness, which was a feat if you've never done it before. And they possessed the knowledge that most men don't really have to know today, equine psychology. And that is a challenge. Now, each man could work with each horse to get them to do what they needed, which is a talent. That is horsemanship. Now, it's very likely it was Giles and Paris who rode his presidential horses. Paris is recorded as having rode Prescott whenever Washington had to ride in the carriage. As with all the men who had to serve at the mansion house, Paris and Giles wore, and I quote, "custom-fitted white and red livery suits, stockings and shoes with buckles, with hair that grew long and tied back into a ponytail." This was a style that was encouraged by Washington, as it was the expected elegance of an 18th century gentleman. Now, Paris and Giles could both ride and drive, often able to do both at the same time. Now, this is because a man could ride a horse as a way to drive the carriage. Now, Paris apparently did have a big personality. Giles was actually the senior coachman. In 1791, Giles was driving a baggage wagon, and at some point on the trip, Giles suffered an injury or illness that affected his ability to ride. 2 months later, Martha Washington lamented in a letter to her niece, "I am sorry for poor Giles and fear he will never be well again." Giles spent the rest of his days at Mount Vernon doing easier tasks around the estate. Ultimately, it was their skill that allowed them the position of driving Washington's coach and carriages, allowing the Washingtons to, quite literally, put their lives in the hands of these well-dressed men. And so, Washington was surrounded by horsemen whenever he was just at home. And these are only two of the men I'm mentioning. There were far more. But ultimately, in regards to horsemen who were equal to Washington in the saddle, none received as much claim to fame as the one who served as his right-hand man during the war. His valet, William Lee. Born in 1752, William was born to the Lee family of the Tidewater region in Virginia near Stratford Hall, which was the Lee Heritage family mansion. Washington had purchased barley for the Lees in his past dealings with them, which would then be ground at his gristmill and good for business. By 1768, William's owner had passed away. His name was John Lee. His widow sold William, who was 16 years old at the time, and his brother Frank to a young George Washington, who was around 36. This was 18 years before Washington's promise not to buy or sell anyone ever again. And several people even credit that it was William Lee who helped alter Washington's feeling toward this later in life. Well, William arrived at Mount Vernon and immediately showed promise. He was raised to the status of Washington's valet. The result is, William would be by Washington's side throughout the rest of his life. He consistently showed trustworthiness to do so. Washington at first referred to him as Billy, as the young man was much younger, especially when they first met. But an interesting thing happened. Washington begins to call him William, because apparently William did not like being called Billy, especially as he got older, because it was a bit boyish of a name. So I will always refer to him as Washington did later in law, not as Billy Lee, but as William Lee. This man was amazing. Washington had a reputation for, and I quote, a very excellent and bold horseman, leaping the highest fences and going extremely quick, without standing upon his stirrups, bearing on the bridle, or letting his horse run wild. Lee was expected to keep up with Washington, and he did. Which means in the saddle, Lee was reported as being the fastest, most controlled horseback rider, as well as a man who jumped the highest fences. The two men made a very capable, formidable pair. As stated in my first video of this series, studying Washington's Spurs, by 1775, the two had departed Mount Vernon, leaving the comforts of family to gain their new military family, and 8 years of adventures began for the both of them. Lee followed Washington, now the new commander-in-chief, across the battlefields in various states of New England and Pennsylvania by 1775. This was a far cry from the fancy experiences he had traveling to and from the governor's palace and capital at Williamsburg, or the fancy streets of Philadelphia, which they would go to during peace times. But by 1776, both men had a venturesome life. Each had to look over each other's shoulders all the time for the constant threat of subterfuge and assassination. As Washington was the most hunted man in the new United States, life had become increasingly precarious for them both. Now, in light of all of this is the underlying relationship the two men seemed to develop. Based upon records, it would seem the two men began to care for each other, as is often the case with soldiers in war. There were even stories of William charging in front of Washington's horse, blocking his horse with his own, to stop Washington from running into enemy fire. Now, these stories are pending further discovery, but it was likely spread by Lee or even fans of Lee later in his life, because Lee became quite the celebrity after the war. People would come to visit him in his retirement at Mount Vernon and hear his war stories. Lee's wartime duties included some very trustworthy positions, such as carrying very sensitive information from Washington to the Army lines. He was also responsible for carrying the general's spyglass and for caring for Washington's general uniforms and goods, including his wartime spurs. And William always kept up and never disappointed. Acting as Washington's shadow, he was present for most of the general's greatest moments. As previously stated, their years of fox hunting together and riding between towns and cities made them both equal caliber horsemen, and this doubtlessly prepared them each to be ready for war. Thank heavens they were, because despite the dangers they were in, they both survived without injury. In fact, a significant source of Washington's success can be owed to William, a fact that did not escape Washington. The war came to an end in October 1783. Washington resigned his military commission. Rather than embrace the glamour of military prestige or even earn a kingship, he simply went home. Doubtless he and William were dearly missing Mount Vernon after the war. Washington did not want to be a professional officer or live off the people's money. The news of this reached King George III of England, of all men. When he learned of this, he was reportedly astonished. The greatest enemy of George Washington was this other George across the pond, who had demanded Washington be killed as a treacherous subject. Now he had apparently regarded him in a light the most distinguished of any man living, the greatest character of his age. In 1783, on Christmas Eve, William and Washington at last turned their horses for home. Riding side by side up to the mansion house, they were met by other servants who took their horses and welcomed them back. Lee had become an uncle during the war and was at last able to meet his new nephews. Their names were Edmund and Mike. And Washington was able at last to embrace his own family and wife and relax in the knowledge that he, William, and Nelson and Blueskin had survived the war. At last, he could be a farmer again. In a few days, however, Washington realized he had loads of work to do as his farms went into disarray without him. They always would. He promptly went about each day riding to go get his hands dirty and make sure all the crops were in working order again. He would likewise face the same issue when he came back home from his presidency years later. William, on the other hand, had more promising projects on the horizon. During the war, he had married. He fell in love with a free woman from Philadelphia while they were stationed there with the military. She was named Margaret Thomas, and the two wed, despite the chaos of war. Lee then asked Washington if she could come to Mount Vernon and permanently reside with him. It would be an extra expense, one Washington did not particularly budget for, and money was tight. Still, Washington assisted Lee, stating, "As he has lived with me so long and followed my fortunes with fidelity." So, Margaret and Lee lived together at Mount Vernon, she a free woman and he a valet of Washington. Sadly, and I'll say this briefly, she was in ill health, and the records indicate that she may have passed away not long afterwards, leaving Lee a widower. But he was always given a position at Mount Vernon next to Washington. And the records indicate that he did have a daughter, so he spent the rest of his days as a father and as a widower, and one of the most renowned men in the entire country. The lives of both men continued, and they often rode around the estate. Once they were visiting an area far inland in Virginia called Abington, and it was here that Lee reportedly had a bad accident. Washington recorded the incident. "We went to a corner of the above land near Abington, 150 yards below the ruins of an old mill. And after having run one course and part of another, my servant William fell and broke a pan of his knee, which put a stop to all work. And with much difficulty, I was able to get him to Abington, being obliged to get a sled to carry him on, as he could neither walk, stand, or ride. Washington managed to get him to the town of Abington, and he paid for immediate medical care. The doctors afterwards had to fit Lee with a steel brace. Well, because of this, Washington immediately gave him an easier trade position at Mount Vernon as a saddle maker. With this, Lee could make and repair saddles, and even shoes, for people on the estate. This was a position in which Lee did not have to stand or even ride ever again, but could sit instead for the majority of his day. Whether or not this was going to be boring for Lee is up to speculation, but it was best for him. He wouldn't be injured anymore. Lee then lived out the rest of his lives in a sort of retirement position. When Washington became president and Washington had to leave for New York, Lee begged to go to him. Washington replied through his secretary, Tobias Lear, if he is still anxious to come on here, the president would gratify him, although he may be troublesome, as Lee's injury made it difficult. He has been an old and faithful servant. This is enough for the president to gratify him in every reasonable wish. In the end, he was allowed to go. Their lives continued, and after their presidency, Washington at last came home again to Mount Vernon with Lee. Lee had continued to live on the estate even after Washington's sudden passing in December 1799, even though Washington had immediately given him freedom after that sad occasion. This is where Washington's endearment for the man really shone through, even more than before. He stated in his last will and testament, "And to my man William, calling himself William Lee, I give him immediate freedom, or, if he should prefer it, on account of the accidents which have befallen him and which have rendered him incapable of walking, or of any active employment, to remain in a situation he now is. It shall be optional in him to do so. In either case, however, I allow him an annual annuity of $30 during his natural life, which shall be independent of the victuals and clothes he had been accustomed to receive. If he chooses to last, the alternative, but full his freedom if he prefers the first. And this I give him as a testimony of my sense of his attachment to me and for his faithful services during the Revolutionary War." We look at a bygone era of classical and classy horsemen. Every Mount Vernon horseman, like Washington, Lee, Giles, Paris, and all horsemen of the estate, whether free or enslaved, would go down in history as phenomenal equestrians and forefathers of American horsemanship. Regarding Washington's spurs, which, no pun intended, spurred all of this research, this shows that the cultural history of an object opens the door to the lives and voices of many people who can no longer speak for themselves, such as George Washington and William Lee.